Um, so to get started, there are a lot of really great key resources that we go to when somebody has a question about finding military records. I think for starters, one of the obvious ones is Fold 3, which is run by Ancestry. So it's a really similar search interface. It's got a lot of really cool features, and it's kind of the go-to for military records. But of course, there are a lot of other great resources as well. I know some of our libraries, Algonquin and specifically has, they offer free access to Fold 3 for their members, which can be accessed at home remotely. So that is a good one if your library offers that. You can always go to their databases page to find out. What is your go-to source that you use, Tina?
For military records, you're absolutely right. It would be Fold 3 would be my primary resource. It was founded originally as Footnote. If you remember back in the day, it was originally called Footnote before it became Fold 3. And it was designed to alleviate the burden on National Archives staff. So when they started that program, probably about 15 years ago, it was to augment. They thought that if they made records available online, that fewer people would want to come into the National Archives to look at records, which is really amusing because what do genealogists do? We're going to take that little crumb that you give us online and we're going to pour into your building to find out what else you have. So it didn't quite work the way the National Archives had anticipated it would work, but it originally started with collections from there and it really has broadened out since then. So you do have a lot of overseas collections that now appear in Fold 3 that are military related.
Yeah, definitely. And what's nice is that they allow you to search a few different ways too. So you can do the keyword search by name. You can also search by conflict or by time period if there are multiple conflicts that are overlapping and you're not exactly sure where your family member was involved. So there's a lot of different resources there that Fold 3 offers. And then there are, of course, the obvious ones, Ancestry and Family Search, both have a really nice selection of military records as well. Those are good options too, especially if you're kind of at a starting point, you're not really sure exactly what you're looking for. I think when I see something pop up, especially in Ancestry, that says something about like a draft card or some kind of some kind of other record that somehow indicates that my ancestor was involved in a military conflict, then I just scoot over to Fold 3 and double check and see what else I can find after that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really the downside is the fact that there's not one place to go for all of your research needs any longer. You know, before it used to be you could go to Ancestry and they would have what you needed. But now that there have been so many of these other websites that have started having exclusive content, it becomes much more difficult to find what you need in just one place. So yes, you have to go to Ancestry. You have to go to Fold 3. You have to go to Family Search. You have to go to the National Archives or other resources that we'll talk about today, because each one is going to have a different piece of that puzzle and to make sure that you're not missing something. So, you know, Ancestry might have state records and, you know, those are going to dovetail into the federal records that you're looking for. So each organization is going to have a different part of that that's going to fill in that whole picture for you.
Yeah, so it's good because there's more available, but complicated because it's spread out everywhere. That's so true. And then, of course, you know, there are other opportunities that aren't necessarily our big databases, like the Daughters of the American Revolution website has some excellent information, both, you know, obviously on Revolutionary War soldiers, but on other family members in more modern conflicts as well. And then, you know, there's the National Archives that offers a lot of information if you can go there in person as well. So there's just a lot that we can do on different topics. So you mentioned going in person to places, Tina. Are there, how do you go about that? Like, how do you find places to research?
Well, it depends on the military engagement. I do this to you every time. You know, you want just one answer and I'm like, well, there's 5 or 6 different answers. Well, it's kind of like, you know, I can never pick a favorite of anything. There's always 2 or 3 that are tied for the lead. It really depends on what you're looking for. So if I'm doing Revolutionary War research, yes, in-person research is going to have to be done at the National Archives most likely, and at the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is one of my absolute favorite sites. If I'm doing, First World War research, I might not necessarily go to the National Archives 1 in DC. I might go straight to St. Louis. I might go to Archives 2 in College Park. I might go to the World War I Museum. If I'm doing Civil War research, what was supposed to open in April was the National Civil War Museum that was supposed to open in Richmond. And because of COVID-19, everything has kind of been pushed out of whack on that. But it's the first time we've had a dedicated Civil War museum in the United States. So it'll be exciting to finally be able to visit that. There's going to be records on the state archives level. There's going to be records at your local historical society and your local library pertaining to the soldiers from your community. There's a different place for every military engagement that you're researching. You're going to start potentially in a different location. But typically I would go to Fold 3 first, see what was available out there. Excuse me. And then depending on the military engagement, I would branch out to other online resources first, mine as much as I can online, take that information, and then start doing a deep dive into, collections that aren't online. So whether it's a collection at the National Archives, whether it's a collection at my local, at the Illinois State Archives, whether it's a collection at a military museum or library, something like, I just drew a complete blank on it. Carlisle, the U.S. Army Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, has an amazing collection of military resources. The Pritzker Military Library and Museum in Chicago. So it depends. I'm gonna kind of scrape off what I can find online and then take it to dig deeper in person.
Yeah, that's so true. And Illinois has a bunch.
It was a very long-winded answer.
No, that was perfect. And I've been doing this long enough to know that there isn't a direct one answer on it either. So I'm sorry for pinning you with a question like that. But it's true that local history museums, I'm always surprised by the amount that they have. But, especially when your entire community, all the young men go off overseas to war, that's like a big deal. And so, we were lucky enough to have Tina at Algonquin for a military history presentation just last week on World War I. And you had mentioned using newspapers to do research as well. And I think that was like such a huge thing, because you're right, in my family, especially in smaller towns, a lot of times those letters will get printed in the newspaper. A lot of times historical societies will keep that stuff, and when a family, especially if they lose a child or multiple childs, that's the kind of day it's been, guys. Multiple children in a conflict or overseas, they'll oftentimes donate that material to the local history society, and so it's always kind of nice to see the amount that they collect over time and what it can kind of tell you about the conflict and what life was like at home during the conflict too, because we've got to remember that the people overseas, the veterans themselves, weren't the only ones affected by these, incredible circumstances of war. It really changed life for everybody, especially ones like the Civil War, or World War I for that matter, where so many people were gone for such a long, extended period of time. So yeah, I think that those are really key things. And also military museums, I think every state has at least one. I know we have a few here. We're lucky enough to have, we have the Pritzker, and of course Cantini. Is that how you say that? I'm never sure. Okay. And I worked at a military museum in Minnesota.
Absolutely right.
Museum too, and so there's
is named after a World War II, or I'm sorry, which is named after a World War I museum.
Okay, great. I'm proving my expertise here.
Right.
Anyway, so there are lots of resources.
Well, there's the Illinois State Military Museum. There's a museum for. Oh, I just lost your sound, Tara.
Can you hear me now? I think I'm having some internet trouble, unfortunately.
Can you still hear me? Because I lost you for a minute. Yes.
Sorry, guys. Maybe I'll let you kind of take over, Tina, since I'm apparently having some lagging issues.
You cut out on me. I lost your sound. Oh no. Tara made a couple of really good points, especially when talking about newspapers. So even if your local community newspaper has not been digitized and made available online, you know, and you can't get to the library to look at it in person, whether in print or on microfilm, if you know what the unit is, or if you know what the battalion or what the ship's name is, then you could still research information about that particular soldier. You might not be able to find him listed individually by name. So if you went out to someplace like Ancestry, newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, Newspaper Archive, Chronicling America, and you put in, like, for example, here in Plainfield, we had Ira Jones, who had served in the 313th Engineers during the First World War. If I were to go into a newspaper and put in Ira Jones, I might not come up with anything. But people around the US are going to be reporting on those units. So I could just do a newspaper search for anywhere in the US that's going to mention the 313th Engineers or the 88th Division that he was a part of. And I'm going to be able to find out what was going on in real time with the men in that unit and with that division. So it's still pertinent to our genealogical research, even though our soldier or sailor or our nurse might not be named specifically in the article, but it's still going to tell you a lot about what they experienced. You know, what types of battles were they in? When did they go overseas? When did they come back? So it's going to provide some family history. We don't just want, you know, a listing of all of the military battles that our soldier was in a vacuum, because they served, like Tara said, with, you know, cousins and neighbors and the milkman down the street and the postman. So if you're lucky enough to find information in the local newspaper about them, or potentially about their unit, it's going to fill in some of those gaps for you. But another thing to keep in mind with newspapers as well is that you're looking in concentric circles. So you're looking for what information you have about your soldier within your community. But then you're branching out and looking for, like, the largest city newspaper near you. So for Plainfield, it wouldn't necessarily be Joliet for me. It depends on where you are. It could be Aurora, which is 2 counties over, because Plainfield had a correspondent to the Aurora Beacon News, which reported on Plainfield more often than the Joliet Herald did. But even then, Plainfield soldiers would be listed in the Chicago Tribune or the Chicago Daily News, or they might be listed in another Chicago newspaper. But each camp had its own newspaper as well. So whether it's the First World War, Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, each base had its own paper. So Camp Dodge had the Camp Dodger. You know, Camp Grant had the Viceroy, or began with a V. I'm drawing a blank on the name of it at the moment. So beyond just Stars and Stripes, which most of us have heard of and are familiar with, each camp had a paper too. So depending on what's going on, you're finding out information about your soldier from your local paper. You're going to see if you can find the camp paper online for that time period in which they were there. But then each camp is near a city, and that city would be reporting on that camp as well. So like Camp Grant in Rockford during the First and Second World Wars, Rockford had 5 newspapers. All 5 of those newspapers were reporting on Camp Grant as well. So you have 3 points to find information about your soldier, about their unit, and about their division, from 3 different angles to kind of triangulate down into more specific information. And the camp newspapers are actually fascinating because there was a lot of downtime. So, you know, they would have to keep themselves busy. So the newspaper would be full of, like, bowling team scores and baseball game scores and boxing match scores, and, you know, what the movies were playing, you know, at the camp theater, and, you know, at the cantina, and what, you know, the canteen, and what was going on. So, and the reporting on what's going on at home. So there would be an at-home column in each of those papers too that would be reporting on, you know, Bob Smith's wife had a baby boy this week, or, you know, so-and-so has been given furlough for a week to go home and help bring in the crop. You know, so they're reporting on, from Camp Dodge, what's going on in New York and in Pennsylvania and in Massachusetts and in Maryland and in South Dakota. So it's not just what's going on in the base, but they're talking about all of their friends and families back home as well. So they could be a huge resource for you.
That's awesome and so true. And I honestly, until you mentioned it, didn't realize that there were so many individual newspapers like that. What a fabulous resource.
Mm-hmm.
And so Shannon, I think, do we have some questions?
Yes, so it looks like we have 4 questions here. So the first one, is the only way to get a copy of a Mexican War widow's pension by ordering it from NARA?
No, actually, you also want to try going to the state as well, because the state archives would enlist men in militias, and then those militias would go on to fight. So you would want to be checking at the state archives too, to see what information might potentially be available as well. So, and it's not just the Mexican War that's going to have information. This is going to be true back to statehood for whatever you're researching. So for Illinois didn't become a state until 1818, so we're not going to have a lot of Revolutionary War or War of 1812 records, but we do have some pension records for them. But we are going to have information at the state archives on the Black Hawk War, on the Mexican War units that went and served, on the Spanish-American War, First World War, Second World War. So the state archives is always a great place to start, because the state would supply their units and they would record different pieces of information than what the federal government was receiving. So you could be getting a lot more information on the state level than what might potentially be available from the federal government.
Awesome.
Okay, so I have another question. So is there a source for identifying military uniforms? I have a great-grandfather painting, and he is supposedly wearing a Persian uniform, but I would like to verify.
I can't think of an online resource off the top of my head, but there's a series of books that are put out by Usborne, USBORNE, on military uniforms and military weaponry, military supplies. They're usually found in children's departments because they're mostly pictorial, which is what you want. You want to be able to look at it and say whether or not it matches the photos and things that you have. But that would probably be the first place that I would go to start, would be to see if they have an Usborne book specifically dealing with Prussian military uniforms.
You could also, I think that's the best way to start. If you run into a real roadblock, I know that the military museum I worked for got a lot of questions like that with photographs, as much detail as you could send. I also look at the insignia, any kind of pins or medals that you can see. Those are really helpful on dating things and kind of narrowing in, because sometimes those uniforms, they get reused and they last as long as they can, especially for some of the other countries. So it can be a little bit more tricky.
Yeah, I might try to check to see if there's a German National Military Museum, and see if they have any photos or other identifying features. And believe it or not, sometimes just doing searches online, like if you go to Flickr and look to see if they've got German collections online, someplace like Shorpy or Retronaut, to see if they have military uniform pictures online. Sometimes those are great resources when I've got an outfit, like what era is this bonnet? I'll go out to Shorpy and put in bonnets and see what comes up. And I'll put, if you haven't heard of Shorpy, I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's a great resource. And it's always surprising how much you can find, because there are other people looking for these same exact things. And there are people who are such experts in just military, or, certain era of fashion, or like I had found out when I worked at that military museum that they had actually hired fashion designers to create the uniforms in World War II, specifically to try to recruit more women into the military, which I thought was just absolutely fascinating. And, the woman who told me that, she was able to tell me all kinds of different things about what distinguishes different uniforms from other ones, and how you can tell the difference between just different years that they actually enlisted based on the designer styles. And it's amazing. I would have had no idea. So there's a lot of that stuff online that you would never even think to ask. So you start Google searching.
Mm-hmm.
All right, what's next, Shannon?
Yeah. Okay, so the next question is, I have a World War I draft card, but don't know if he served. Is there a way to find out?
Probably the quickest and the down and dirtiest way to find out whether or not somebody served, I would go to Ancestry and I would look at their U.S. transport records. So there's a collection in Ancestry, as well as Ancestry Library Edition. So if you don't have a subscription to Ancestry.com, you can still get access to it. But it's U.S. transport U.S. Army transport lists, I think up to 1938 or 1939. If you find their name on the list, it means that they absolutely went overseas to France. So they were in the AEF, they weren't just in the Army and stayed stateside. That's usually the quickest way. It doesn't help if they stayed stateside and they never went overseas. But the National Archives, can I share my screen, Tara? I
Yeah,
don't know if I have the ability. Do I have the ability to do that?
I think you should.
Okay, hold on just a second. So I had the National Archives website pulled up just in case. So can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. So if you go to the National Archives website, if you go to archives.gov, you have a link here for Veterans Service Records. If you click on that link, there's a collection in there that's called the AAD. So let me scroll down just a little bit. Researching military records. So if we go in here, now I got to find it because they changed their website a little bit on me, so it doesn't look exactly the same. So if they still have it, and I hope they do, oh, we want First World War, don't we? Go up a little. There's what, yeah, see how it says AED? So there are collections in here where you can search. One of them is specifically for World War II. So if you wanted to see if somebody served, was actually, you know, enlisted in the military during the Second World War, you'd be able to go in and search that collection for them and for Korea. For the First World War, if they don't show up right away in the transport files, then I would probably go to the National Archives and I would look through the catalog. So just go to archives.gov, but instead of going to military records, go to search online, because they've got a number of collections that they have put online in the last 6 months, where you can search by name for soldiers. So the potential is there that you might have their qualification card that's been digitized. They might show up in some of the casualty reports that have been published online. Some of the casualty reports show up in Fold 3 as well. But what I want you to realize when I mention the word casualty, it does not mean death. When you're talking about casualties in a military sense, that's talking about those who have been wounded as well as those who have died. So casualty reports would include somebody who caught the measles in the Second World War or caught the flu during the pandemic in the First World War. It would include people who were, you know, had minor shrapnel wounds. It would include people who were, you know, killed in action. So when I mention casualty lists, don't automatically say, oh, Dad came back, he wouldn't show up in those. If he had caught the German measles at the start of the Second World War, he's going to show up in these casualty lists. So then I would probably go through Fold 3 and see if maybe they're listed in one of those casualty reports as being sick and in the hospital or something else, to try to look for those guys who stayed stateside. But your state archives, depending on where they served, sometimes have indexes to soldiers. So I would look on the state level. I'd look locally to see if my local community has a monument, like Plainfield has a monument that has the names of World War I soldiers listed on it. I'd contact the cemetery to see if he's designated as a veteran. I had mentioned in my lecture with Tara on World War I records last week that I typically try to stay away from the VA just because of the red tape associated with the VA. It takes a really, really long time to get any information out of them. And usually they don't provide you with much. So I would probably look at other sources and only use the VA, the state VA, not even the federal VA, as a last resort. I don't know if that helped at all.
I think it did. And I think that's a really good warning about the VA too, just so you know what you're getting into ahead of time, because that can be frustrating if that's your first stop and you just run into a lot of roadblocks.
The downside about the First World War is that they haven't brought all of those collections together in one place. So, you know, while you've got really great online resources for Civil War soldiers through the National Park Service, and you've got a great index to Revolutionary War soldiers through the DAR, the U.S. really has dropped the ball on making one of those available for First World War soldiers. And it's terribly disappointing, because for the Second World War, you've got NARA, you've got your AAD, where I can search for soldiers by name. You know, you have a list through Fold 3 for Vietnam War vets. So there's still this gap, this void for First World War to get an every name index of everybody, all the 4.2 million men and women who served. So check to see if they went overseas, see if they're in that transport list. If they're not in that transport list, then you've got a little bit more digging to do. But one thing to keep in mind about First World War draft cards is that the first draft didn't take place until June 17th of 1917, and the war started on April 6th. So there are a lot of guys who don't show up in that first draft because they had already registered and enlisted in the Army and the Navy. So if you're not finding a soldier listed in a draft card, there could be a number of reasons. They could have already enlisted. They could have already been working for the government in some capacity. The draft was done on one day, kind of like British censuses. So these were done on one day, and wherever you were, you had to register. So if you worked for the railroad and you were in Galena, like my Angus was, he had to register for the draft in Galena, even though he was from Aurora in Plainfield. So if you were on board a ship as a merchant marine, how are you supposed to register? If you're in the hospital, if you're in an institution, if you're in jail, how are you supposed to register? So there are gaps in records because of those people who may have been overseas for one reason or another, who don't show up right away because those cards need to be mailed back from the US embassies. So sometimes there's gaps in records.
Yeah, good point. And there are gaps in records where they've been destroyed too, wasn't there? There was a lot of World War I records that were destroyed.
Well, at the National Archives, there was the fire that happened in the 1970s that destroyed about 75% of U.S. Army and Army Air Corps records, all the way up to 1960.
Okay.
So from 1912 to 1960, there's a huge void of records there. If you had somebody in that time period who served in the Navy or in the Marines, they're perfect. They're in perfect condition. They weren't caught in the fire. And it wasn't necessarily the fire that caused the most damage. It was the 4 days worth of water that they poured into the building to put out the fire, because it was paper that was burning. So it was incredibly hot, and it took a long time to get the fire put out. But the National Archives, the National Personnel Records Office in St. Louis, is the branch of the National Archives responsible for military records and for government employee records. So not only do they have military records from 1912 to the present, but if you had somebody who was postmaster, if you had somebody who worked for the U.S. Fire Marshal Service, if they were a National Park Service employee, those records are in St. Louis as well, and you would have access to those. They also have CCC personnel files. So if you had, like my grandpa Casey had joined the CCC in the 1930s, they have all of those applications as well. So they have a lot more than just military records. But because of that fire, there's not a way to do kind of a show of hands here, but I'd be curious to know how many of you had sent a letter to NPRC and had gotten a letter back that said these are fire records. So they send you a form back that says, tell us everything you know, to which I scoff. Why would I ask you if I already knew? So, you know, they want to try to recreate some type of record for you based on what you know. So whether that's contacting the county for a copy of the discharge paper, or contacting the military base to see if there are any records of them there, or looking for unit records or hospital stay records, they try to recreate some kind of file for you so that you're not just getting that letter that says, sorry, we've got 3 pages, you know, their card verifying that they served. If they were in the hospital, there'd be 1 sheet, and then their final payment voucher would be in there. So they try to help you out and help recreate those. But if you have somebody who is in the Navy, those files are 60, 70, 80 pages long. It's little booklets with every port of call, everywhere they stopped, every liberty, every leave, you know, their thumbprint, their photo, their height, their weight. I mean, they're phenomenal records. They're really, really cool if you're lucky enough to have a sailor.
And I think that segues into our next question, doesn't it, Shannon?
About the merchant marine.
Yeah.
Okay, is there a source to find merchant marine records?
The merchant marine records originally lived at Fort Knox, along with what was called the IDPFs, which was the individual deceased persons files. Those were transferred from Fort Knox to St. Louis, and the NPRC has been adding them to their collections. So first I'll talk about merchant marine records. So, you know, their merchant marine records are very hit or miss because they weren't an official recognized branch of the U.S. Navy or the U.S. government. So what they've collected is largely post 1948, but they do have some World War II era records. I have a form that I can email anybody who wants it. So I'm going to put my email address in here, and you guys can email me, and I can send you. The National Archives St. Louis had put out a list of the types of records that they have, and there's several merchant marine collections that are listed in there. But if you're just interested in getting the list for whatever military service you're researching, I want to make sure that I can send that to you. If I can make sure that I spell I gotta use my bifocals. Make sure that I spell, oh, I didn't spell it right. Make sure I spell my email address right, because it's very long and very painful.
I have the same problem, only mine's when I'm spelling with my mouth, so I can't even use my eyes as an excuse.
Well, I mean, you've got an abbreviation, you know. I have to spell out Plainfield Public Library every time I type my email address in there. But they moved a bunch of collections. The National Archives 1 in DC has some books, some merchant marine books. The National Archives at Great Lakes in Chicago has a collection of merchant marine logs that are the published books that they put out every year with the names of the ships and everything on them. So there are some more actual published books that are available through some of the National Archives branches, but the individual service records for the merchant marines would be in St. Louis. I mentioned Fort Knox also moved what are called the IDPH, the individual deceased persons files. Those are World War II era. So if you had somebody who was killed in action during the Second World War, I had somebody who went down on the Indianapolis, I can request a copy of their individual deceased persons files, and it is going to give you in detail, keep this in mind. So if you're faint of heart, you might not necessarily want to know to that level of detail, but they will tell you exactly what happened to that person and to that body. So there are records like that that exist at St. Louis for the First World War, but they're just called burial case files, and it's just the aftermath. So if the body was moved, it was in a temporary grave, and then it was moved to a cemetery, they were interred overseas, or their body was shipped back and they were interred here, you would have that file, but it wouldn't tell you about the actual cause of death. The individual deceased persons files tell you about the actual cause of death, exactly what happened. So those are available from St. Louis, as well as the OMPFs, which is the official military personnel file. That's your individual serviceman's file. So those are all the types of things that you can look at in St. Louis. A couple of things that, and you need to make an appointment. You need to fill out the form. So I'll give you an example. So if you email them, they will allow you to ask for 12 records per day, but they won't limit the number you can look at when you go there in person. They're trying to keep from being inundated on a daily basis. So I submitted 24 records over the course of 2 days to look at this spring. And the more records you request, the longer it takes, because they have to physically pull the record before they tell you they have it and give you a date to come down and look at it. So if you're just looking for 1 or 2 records, it won't take too long, maybe 6 to 8 weeks. But if you're looking for me, like for 25 records, it can take 4 or 5 months. So I had submitted my records. I was looking for official military personnel files, and I was looking for IDPF records. They finally got back to me and said, okay, we found them all. You know, let's schedule your appointment. I was scheduled to go down on, March 20th. That never happened because they're closed down now. But they will pull records for you and have them available for you to come down and view them in person at no cost. So I can bring my own scanner. I can bring my own camera. I can bring, a multitude of equipment. You just can't bring the handheld scanners because they don't want you to damage the records. But you can bring your camera, your iPhone, your scanner, your laptop, and make copies of all those records for free at no cost. But you have to have an appointment to look at those. They have court-martial records as well. You have to make an appointment to look at those. But there are 2 collections that you don't need to have an appointment for that are on microfilm that you could just walk right in the door anytime you want and take a look at them. And those are the monthly reports and the muster rolls for the units. And they have these from the First World War up to Korea. And those monthly reports are what they call the war diaries. That's the company clerk, that's the Radar O'Reilly, who is keeping track of what's going on from day to day. So it is, you know, we are here on March 15th. We have moved to here on March 17th. We have moved to here on March 21st. It's the men coming and leaving the unit. How many are out sick? How many are wounded? How many have been killed? You know, how many have been reassigned? So it's that daily paperwork that they're keeping track of everybody coming and going, as well as supplies coming in and out. How many foodstuffs do we have? Do we have enough tanks? Do we have enough bullets? Do we have enough uniforms and blankets? Those are on microfilm. And then the muster rolls are those rolls exactly what you think they would be, just like the Civil War, where it is a quarterly report of each and every man by name and rank and serial number that's in that unit. And those are available on microfilm, and you could walk into the National Archives in St. Louis, NPRC, anytime and take a look at those records.
So speaking of records, where could we find those camp newspapers that you mentioned earlier?
The Library of Congress has an extensive list on their website that'll list whether it's the motor pool, whether it's Camp Dodge, whether it's Fort Dix, whatever it happens to be. The Library of Congress, so if you go to loc.gov, and look through their card catalog, you can search for camp newspapers. That list is available out there. Some of them are already digitized and available online. If you had somebody during the First World War who was at Great Lakes Naval Base, those are already online, and they're online for free. So you can find them in Chronicling America. So you could do a Google search to find out what the newspaper's name is and find out if it's available online. If you don't find it, then I would turn to the Library of Congress and see if you can find it. You can always contact the military base, because a lot of times they have museums. Like Camp Gramp has a teeny tiny little museum, but they don't have the papers, but like Camp Dodge does. It just depends on the base and whether or not they still have a museum. Sometimes you can find them through them, but more and more they're starting to show up online. Like the Stars and Stripes is available online through Ancestry, but it's just the overseas edition. So there was a stateside edition, there was a European theater edition, and there was a Pacific theater edition. So it depends. And I think the one that's only available on Ancestry.com might be the European theater edition. But keep in mind, there were 3 separate. Same with the First World War. There was a Stars and Stripes stateside, and there was a Stars and Stripes in France.
Oh, good to know. Do we have any other questions, Shannon?
Yes, so we have a couple more. So another one would be, are military records, like census records, only available when a certain amount of time has passed? I'd like to get my father's military personnel file. He's passed in 2012. Thanks.
So the way the National Archives in St. Louis works is they work on a rotating calendar of 72 years. So records are available to the public 72 years back from today's date. So my math is horrid, but I think it's 1958, 1957. See, I became a librarian because all I had to do was memorize numbers, not add or subtract. But it's a 72-year rolling schedule. So tomorrow, 72 years. October 1st, 72 years. And what that means is that after 72 years, they're available to anybody. So I could go in and look at anybody's record. If it's more recent than that, then you need to be next of kin. And the National Archives has a very strict ruling on what they consider to be next of kin. So that would be unremarried widow. So if your spouse remarries after you die, she is no longer next of kin, or he would no longer be next of kin. Your children, your siblings, and your parents. If you are a grandchild, a niece, a cousin, you are not next of kin. And you would have to either put in a FOIA request or ask somebody who is next of kin in order to request that record. If you are next of kin, there is no cost. If you are requesting it by mail and you are not next of kin, then you would have to pay the service fee and the mailing costs that go along with that. If it's the soldier, they can request their records and there's no governor. You don't have to wait any amount of time. It's not limited to whether or not the person is still alive or not. So even if your dad has passed, and I'm sorry for your loss, you don't have to wait a certain number of years. What you would do is you would fill out the form on the National Archives webpage. You would print out the signature page and mail it in so they know you're a real person and you're not a bot that's scraping for information. But you would just include that information. You'd put on the form the date of death then. you know, so you'd put all the information you know, because we think names are unique. And here's what's really bizarre. My grandpa's name was Casimir. No, it wasn't Casimir. It was Casimir, Casmer, Tatara, Tatara. There were actually two Casimir Tataras that served in the Second World War. One served from Illinois and the other one served from Massachusetts, and they're completely different people. What's even freakier is both of their mothers' names were Sophia. They're Polish. It's not uncommon. But we think our soldiers unique. So if you just say John Smith, Chicago, there could be 25 John Smiths from Chicago. So you have to fill out as much as you know, date of birth, date of death, who their parents are, who their next of kin is, who would have been there in case of an emergency contact. So as much as you know, if you know their social security number, if you know their service number, that makes it really easy. But if you have somebody who served in more than one engagement, like I have a soldier who served in the First and Second World War, I have to put a separate request in for each one because his service record, his service number in World War II was different than his service number in the First World War. So you have to make sure that if they served in more than one engagement, that you're alerting them to that and you're requesting both sets of records.
That's really good to know. Thanks for sharing that. I don't think I would have realized that. Do we have another question, Shannon?
Yes. Are draft board workers also at St. Louis?
No, the individual draft board records would be within the communities where the draft board was held or the state archives. So if you're looking for draft board records for Chicago for the Second World War, those are the state archives in Springfield. So it depends on where you're looking. Chicago had multiple draft boards, so you would kind of have to know what you were looking for, like a general geographic area within the city, if it's a big city especially. Someplace like Will County even had 2 draft boards for the whole county. So you would just kind of start, if it's in Illinois, I would start with the Illinois State Archives. And if you go to their website, it's library host. Oh, I got to think of what it is because it changed. It used to be Archon, but it changed. So if you just do a Google search for Illinois State Archives online catalog, it's ls.library.org, I think. But you could do a search for it and it'll bring up the record group, and it's going to tell you what records and materials they have available, and it's going to tell you whether or not they're accessible to the public. Because some collections have a governor on them. They're sealed for a certain number of years. So like I had asked, the State Archives has First World War bonus record files that they're digitizing now. They also have Second World War in Korea bonus records. So applications for the men who were asking for their bonus after the Second World War in Korea. Those are sealed because they have a 75-year seal on them. So you just need to check and see whether or not those records collections are open and whether or not you have access to them.
Awesome. So just so everybody knows, we've had an incredible number of questions. Thank you so much for bringing all of your questions. There are a couple longer ones, Tina. Is it all right if I email those to you with the email addresses of the participants afterwards, and maybe you can help them out with their longer questions after? And we'll just jump to the short ones.
I will be, I hate to do this because I hate to steal the show.
Yeah.
I'm doing a webinar at my library. So if you go to plainfieldpubliclibrary.org and you go to our events calendar, I'm doing a military genealogy webinar next Tuesday morning at 10.
Perfect.
But if you go out to the registration page, the hand is already up. There's a lot of resources ready that might answer some of those questions on where you might go for Spanish-American War veterans records. That's available. Download it, use it if it's helpful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll be doing a webinar on military records again on Tuesday morning.
That is perfect. Okay, so to jump to one of the shorter questions, Shannon, do you want to let us know what's next?
Sure. So the next one is, does Great Lakes have records for the 90-day wonders?
Oh, I've not heard of them before. I'm very intrigued by them. I haven't heard of the 90-day wonders, but what Great Lakes has, what National Archives at Great Lakes has, is it's going to have records related to the base itself. It's not going to have personnel files. So it's going to be things like the gate log, who's coming and who's going. It's going to have things like the water temperature, the air temperature. It's going to have information about hospital staff and maintenance crews and things like that, but it's not going to be personnel files. So if I was looking for an individual unit and I wanted more information on that unit, I would go to the National Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. So what the National Archives has over 50 different locations across the US. Archives 1 in DC is where the Constitution and the Declaration are held. And those are records from the Revolutionary War up to 1912. So if I'm looking for Civil War records, if I'm looking for Revolutionary War records, War of 1812 records, War of 1812 pension files, land records, those are going to be in DC. If I'm looking for records pertaining to military service after 1912, personnel are St. Louis, unit records are in College Park, Maryland. And if you go to Archives 1, you can get on the shuttle. It takes 45 minutes. They drive you to College Park, and you can take the shuttle back at the end of the day. You don't have to drive to Maryland. You could take the shuttle that the National Archives offers. But what College Park has are those unit files about those first, second, and Vietnam and more modern engagement records. So for example, my Angus went overseas in the AEF during the First World War. He was with the 46 CAC, which is the Coastal Artillery Unit. Those records on the unit are in College Park. So I could see the unit files of when they got there, you know, all of their troop movements. I can see information about Angus being promoted from staff sergeant or from supply sergeant to sergeant. I can find information about who wound up in the hospital because they caught the flu or because they were wounded. There's a lot of information that's in those records. Same thing with Second World War. If you had somebody who was a POW, those records are in College Park, Maryland. And there's an index, there's a paper index to those POW soldiers who during the Second World War. So if I'm looking for unit information, I'm going to go to College Park. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
Yeah, I think that was super helpful. So the one last question we have is, if they close a base, BRAC, do they usually send the records they have somewhere specific?
It depends on the types of files. They might split them up based on those categories I was talking about. So if it's information about how the base is run, you know, who's on the maintenance crews, who's running the hospital, staff in the hospital, the gate logs, the gate records, those would go to the regional archives. So if that base is, Fort Dix, then they would go to New York. If they're down at Georgia or if they're at Parris Island, those records are going to go to Atlanta. It depends on where the base is stationed, what regional archives they're going to go to. So then the unit records would go to College Park. The personnel files would go to St. Louis.
That makes perfect sense. And that is everything that we have. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Tina. Just to do a couple of really brief housekeeping things. We are doing these genealogy Zoom chats every week now through the end of July. We have not published our schedule or made available the registration for June or July quite yet. That should be coming in the next couple weeks, mainly because we're looking for input from all of you for topics. So if you've got an area that you're struggling with, you need questions answered on a specific topic, or something you're just interested in, please feel free to send me an email. My email is Tara, you can see it, it's my name down here on my Zoom chat thing, tara.kajacobs@aapld.com. I will put it in the chat for all of you too. Please don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'm sorry, aapld.org. See, I told you. Don't hesitate to shoot me an email and let me know what you would like to see or if you've got any questions. We're always excited to help you guys out with your genealogy, and now especially with our buildings being closed, we look forward to any opportunity to interact or help you guys out. So upcoming, we have next week, we have a couple librarians coming to talk about DNA research, which I think is going to be a really fun, interesting subject. I think there's going to be a lot of questions, so come with yours. We're going to have Kate Mills and Ann Kunzen come talk about it. And I know Kate, I haven't heard Ann speak, but Kate does a lot of comparison between different DNA kits. She is well known for her DNA Showdown presentation that she does. So it should be really a fun and informational talk. And then on Wednesday, May 27th, again at 6 o'clock, we'll be doing using Family Search. So we talked about Ancestry earlier in the month, and you can see the recording of that Zoom chat if you go to the Eventbrite page, which is just genealogychat.eventbrite.com. It's listed there, or on the AAPLD YouTube page, it's there as well. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about Family Search specifically. We did a little bit on the differences between Family Search and Ancestry in that talk. And then again, just send us your topics for June and July, and we would love to answer some questions. Thank you all so much. And thanks, Tina, again, for sharing your expertise. You're always so generous with your knowledge, and it's just such a pleasure doing these chats with you.
Well, thank you, Tara. Hopefully everybody got something out of it. Again, you can go to the Plainfield Library website, download that handout. Hopefully it might answer some of your questions. If not, feel free to email either of us.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, thanks so much. Have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe. Be well.